The classroom smelled of chalk and old wood, the kind of scent that clung to forgotten places. Harold Bennett stood at the front, his suit faded and his glasses forever sliding down his nose, his voice soft against the roar of laughter. He tried to teach, to hold their attention with lessons that mattered, but the students didn't listen. They whispered, mocked, and shouted jokes at him as if he were not a teacher at all but some harmless figure made for ridicule. "Why don't you teach us something useful, Mr. Bennett? Like how to get a real job," one boy sneered, and the room burst into cruel laughter. Harold said nothing. He simply turned back to the chalkboard, but inside, the words lodged like a thorn. It wasn't the first time. Parents, colleagues, even the principal had dismissed him as weak, unworthy of respect. His patience had become a curse. He walked home each day with the same battered briefcase and the same quiet shame. Shopkeepers pitied him, neighbors whispered about him, children pointed and laughed. In his small, dim apartment, with its flickering lamp and sagging shelves, he was alone. But there, surrounded by stacks of second-hand law books, Harold became someone else. He read late into the night, not out of curiosity but desperation. Case after case, ruling after ruling, he studied because knowledge was the only weapon left to him. One rainy afternoon at the school, he reached his breaking point. The hallway walls were plastered with cruel drawings, cartoons of him with oversized glasses and ragged clothes. Students and teachers laughed openly as he walked by. "Bennett the buffoon," a girl said, her voice sharp and mocking. Something inside him cracked. He dismissed his class early, walked home in the storm, and sat in the dark until the tears dried and rage replaced them. That night, he swore he would no longer be the man they mocked. He vanished from their world soon after. Whispers spread that he had gone mad, or that shame had driven him away. The truth was different. Harold resigned from teaching, moved to the city, and walked into law school lecture halls where no one knew his past. He was older than most of his classmates, poorer too, but he worked harder than all of them. Nights blurred into dawns as he juggled jobs, rent, and endless reading. Slowly, the mockery faded from his memory, replaced by determination that burned like fire. Years passed. Harold graduated with honors, passed the bar, and began his climb through the courts. Case by case, he earned respect not through kindness but through brilliance, patience sharpened into precision. He became known as fair, relentless, and incorruptible. The man once called a buffoon now commanded silence when he entered a room. And then, one morning, fate drew its cruel circle. Wearing a black robe, Harold Bennett sat behind the judge's bench, his glasses glinting under the lights. The gavel rested in his hand, and the room hushed as the next case was called. The defendants entered, shuffling nervously, and Harold felt the years fold into one moment. He knew their faces at once, older but familiar, the very students who had once humiliated him, who had laughed and spat insults in his classroom. Now they stood accused of fraud, their futures hanging by a thread. The silence pressed in as he adjusted his glasses. Once, their laughter had filled the air. Now, not a sound. The balance had shifted. Harold Bennett, the man they once mocked, held their fate in his hands. The courtroom felt heavy with silence, the kind that presses against the skin and makes even breathing sound loud. Harold Bennett sat high upon the bench, his robe black as night, his expression unreadable. The defendants shuffled nervously at their table, trying to whisper, trying to keep their composure. But when Harold's eyes fell upon them, they froze. He saw the flicker of recognition in their faces, saw how memory sparked and then spread like wildfire. They knew him. The years had aged them, but not enough to erase their old arrogance. Faces once youthful and cruel were now drawn with lines of greed and indulgence. Yet beneath their polished suits and forced confidence, Harold still saw the children who had mocked him, who had turned him into a joke. The echo of their laughter rang in his mind. It was as if the classroom had followed them all into this chamber of law. One of them, Marcus, the loudest of them in school, the one who had called him useless again and again, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering in panic. That's Bennett. That's the teacher." His voice cracked despite his attempt to remain calm. His lawyer frowned, confused, and tried to quiet him. But Harold had already heard. The judge's gavel struck once, firm and steady, silencing the murmurs. His voice carried differently now, no longer soft, no longer uncertain. "This court will come to order." He looked down at them, and though his tone remained formal, his gaze burned with something unspoken. The charges were read aloud: fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. Crimes that revealed not just dishonesty but deep corruption, the kind that destroyed lives and ruined families. Harold listened carefully, but his mind traveled backward in time. He saw Marcus throwing paper balls across the classroom. He heard Sophia mocking his clothes. He remembered the hallway filled with cruel drawings, his name dragged through dirt. The past and present blurred until the defendants became children again, smirking in the back of his classroom, blind to the weight of their actions. But Harold did not smirk. He did not let revenge slip through in obvious ways. He had become more than a teacher. He was the law now, and the law required restraint. What he felt in his chest was not childish vengeance but a profound, patient justice that had waited for this moment. The defendants avoided his eyes, shifting in their seats, but every time they looked up, he was there, unblinking, reminding them of who he was. They could not escape the truth. The man they had dismissed as worthless now stood as the arbiter of their destiny. When the prosecutor rose to speak, outlining the years of deception these defendants had committed, Harold watched with careful attention. He let the facts unfold, each accusation striking like a hammer, each piece of evidence tightening the noose around them. And while the courtroom listened in tense silence, Harold's mind whispered its own refrain: "You laughed at me. You tore me down. And yet here we are." As the session drew to a close for the day, Harold delivered his final words with deliberate calm. "This court will reconvene tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock sharp. Until then, the defendants are remanded into custody." His gavel fell with a sharp crack that echoed through the chamber. The guards moved in, and the once proud men and women who had laughed at him were led away, their hands trembling as the chains closed around their wrists. For the first time in years, Harold allowed himself the faintest smile, hidden behind the solemn mask of his role. The classroom was gone, the ridicule had passed, but the lesson remained. And now, he would be the one to teach it. The morning sun filtered weakly through the high courtroom windows, casting long, solemn beams across the polished wooden floor. Harold Bennett sat once more at the bench, the robe hanging heavy upon his shoulders. His glasses caught the light, reflecting like two small shields as he scanned the crowded room. The whispers of anticipation filled the air. This case had already drawn attention. Wealthy families, local reporters, curious onlookers, all had come to watch the spectacle. The defendants entered, led by guards, their confidence eroded further overnight. Their suits were wrinkled, their faces drawn pale. Marcus kept his head low, Sophia glanced nervously at the gallery, and the others shifted uneasily. They had once ruled the schoolyard, their mockery loud and sharp. Now, they were reduced to anxious whispers and trembling hands. The prosecutor rose with a stack of files in hand, his voice strong and commanding. "Your Honor, the state will present evidence showing that the defendants conspired to siphon millions from the very foundation they swore to protect. This was not negligence. This was deliberate theft, cloaked in respectability." He motioned toward the stack of papers. "We will demonstrate how their greed destroyed lives, how families lost everything while these individuals enriched themselves." The gallery murmured, the weight of the words sinking into the room. Harold remained still, though inside, he felt a storm. He watched the faces of his former students, now turned criminals, and remembered their laughter echoing against classroom walls. Back then, their cruelty had seemed unstoppable, their confidence untouchable. Now, that same arrogance had become their undoing. Marcus's lawyer rose, his tone defensive, desperate. "Your Honor, these are baseless accusations, twisted facts. My clients are respected members of this community, not criminals. This is nothing but a witch hunt." His words rang hollow, bouncing against the walls of the chamber without conviction. Harold listened patiently, his hands folded, his expression measured. But when his gaze met Marcus's eyes, the room seemed to shrink. Marcus tried to hold his stare but faltered, shifting in his seat, his mouth tight with fear. The memory of years ago returned. Marcus laughing at him in front of the class, daring him to fight back. Back then, Harold had stayed silent. Now, silence was no longer weakness. It was power. The prosecutor began presenting evidence: bank statements, contracts, emails that left little doubt. Each page turned was another nail in the coffin of the defendants. The gallery leaned forward, eyes wide, as the story of betrayal unfolded piece by piece. Harold's mind drifted for a moment as he studied Sophia, who once mocked his clothes and whispered cruel jokes into the ears of others. He wondered if she remembered those days, if she could see the symmetry now. Did she realize that every cruel word, every careless insult, had been building toward this moment? The defense objected, protested, but each attempt seemed weaker than the last. The truth pressed down on them, undeniable and heavy. Harold felt the tension of the room like a wire stretched to its breaking point. When the time came for adjournment, Harold spoke with deliberate calm, his voice filling the chamber. "This court will continue tomorrow. The evidence presented thus far is substantial, and this court expects nothing less than clarity and honesty from all parties involved." He paused, letting his words linger, letting them feel the weight of his authority. "Until then, The defendants remain in custody. The gavel fell once more, sharp as thunder. Guards stepped forward, and the defendants were led away, their heads bowed. The gallery buzzed with excitement, the whispers growing louder. As Harold rose from the bench, he glanced once more at the departing figures of Marcus and Sophia. The teacher they had mocked was gone. The man who stood here now was something they had never believed he could become. Justice was no longer a distant dream. It was real, and it was in his hands. The courtroom was packed tighter than ever the next morning, the air tense with expectation. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, cameras clicked softly in the back, and curious townspeople leaned forward in their seats as though they were about to witness a play. But this was no performance. This was real, and the stakes were higher than anyone outside the courtroom could truly understand. The defendants shuffled in again, escorted by guards, chains clinking faintly at their wrists. Their eyes darted around the room, but they avoided Harold Bennett's gaze. Marcus looked particularly worn, his once cocky expression now replaced by dark circles under his eyes and a clenched jaw. Sophia sat rigidly, her face pale, her hands twisted together in her lap. For the first time, the cruel laughter of their youth seemed very far away. The prosecutor wasted no time. He called witnesses to the stand, accountants, former employees of the foundation, even victims whose lives had been shattered by the defendant's schemes. Each testimony landed like a hammer blow. A mother's trembling voice recounted how the scholarship fund, drained by fraud, had left her son unable to attend university. A businessman described how investments were stolen, promises broken. The details were damning, each story weaving a net of guilt around the defendants. The defense tried to push back. Their lawyer objected, argued, painted the witnesses as unreliable, but the desperation in his tone only deepened the cracks in his case. He was fighting shadows, and everyone in the room knew it. Through it all, Harold remained the steady center. He listened, his hands folded, his face calm. But beneath the surface, a storm brewed. He remembered vividly the afternoons in that old classroom, when Marcus would lead the others in laughter while Sophia whispered cruel names under her breath. He remembered standing at the blackboard, trying to hold his composure as they stripped him of dignity. Those memories were no longer wounds. They were fuel. At one point, Marcus caught his eye, just a fleeting moment, and Harold saw the panic there. The boy who once mocked him now sat shackled, powerless, waiting for his judgment. The irony was almost unbearable. Harold adjusted his glasses slowly, a familiar gesture from years ago, and Marcus looked away. The afternoon grew heavier as more evidence was presented. Charts, emails, recordings, each one a thread pulled until the whole tapestry of deceit was laid bare. The jury shifted uncomfortably, their expressions grim. The gallery was silent, hanging on every word, every revelation. Finally, as the day drew to its close, Harold leaned forward. His voice was steady, deliberate, every syllable carrying weight. This court has heard significant testimony and reviewed substantial evidence. The truth has begun to emerge, and it is not flattering to the defendants. His eyes swept across the room, lingering on Marcus and Sophia. But justice is not rushed. We will continue to hear all arguments before this court reaches its conclusion. The gavel struck, sharp and final. The sound echoed through the chamber like a warning bell. The guard stepped forward, and the defendants rose reluctantly, their chains rattling in the quiet room. The gallery erupted into murmurs as they were led away, faces pale, shoulders heavy. As Harold gathered his papers, he allowed himself a single private thought. Once they had laughed at him as if he were powerless, unworthy, invisible. Now, their futures balanced on his every word. The lesson they had forced upon him in cruelty was now returned to them in silence, in patience, in justice. And this was only the beginning. The fifth day of hearings began with a storm outside, rain lashing against the tall windows, thunder rolling faintly in the distance. Inside, the storm was quieter but no less fierce. The courtroom brimmed with tension, the jury weary but attentive, the gallery filled with faces eager for drama. Harold Bennett sat at the bench, his robe draped over his shoulders like armor, his gaze steady as the guards led the defendants in. They looked worse than before. Sleepless nights had carved deep lines into their faces. Their suits no longer carried the sharpness of power. Instead, they hung loose, wrinkled, defeated. Marcus, who had once been the loudest voice in the classroom, the ringleader of their ridicule, could not stop his leg from shaking under the table. Sophia's lips pressed together so tightly they had lost all color. Another of their number, Daniel, stared blankly ahead, his composure unraveling thread by thread. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Your Honor," he began, his voice clear and cold, "today we will present evidence of direct correspondence between the defendants. Emails, financial records, and messages that leave no doubt of intent. This was not carelessness. This was theft, calculated and deliberate. The documents were displayed one by one, projected for all to see. Transactions traced like trails of blood, showing money siphoned off into hidden accounts. Messages exchanged between the defendants revealed their awareness, their greed, their mockery of the very people they had stolen from. Each new piece struck the air like a hammer blow, leaving the jury grim and silent. It was Daniel who cracked first. As the prosecutor read aloud an email in which Daniel had boasted about bleeding the fund dry, the man buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook, and though he tried to suppress it, a sob broke free. The gallery gasped softly. Marcus leaned toward him, whispering harshly, but Daniel only shook his head, his voice hoarse as he muttered, "I can't do this anymore. I can't." The judge's gavel struck once. The room froze. Harold Bennett's eyes fell on Daniel, steady, unyielding. "You will compose yourself, sir," he said, his tone calm but edged with steel. Daniel straightened, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. Harold's mind traveled back in time once again. He saw Daniel as a boy, sitting in the back row, laughing along with Marcus, never brave enough to mock aloud but always eager to join in the cruelty. Now, that same boy sat trembling, his bravado shattered, his future collapsing around him. The defense tried to regain control, insisting Daniel was overwhelmed by the pressure of the trial, but the damage was done. The jury had seen the cracks, had seen how guilt seeped through no matter how tightly it was pressed down. Through it all, Harold remained silent, watching, measuring. He was not the boy's teacher anymore, not the fragile man who endured their laughter. He was the judge. The man who held their lives in his hands. And in Daniel's trembling, he saw the truth laid bare. The mocking children had grown into fragile adults, and now their cruelty had come back for them, piece by piece. As the session drew to a close, Harold spoke in his even, measured tone. "The evidence presented today is clear. Tomorrow, this court will hear further testimony. Until then, the defendants will remain in custody." The gavel fell, sharp as thunder, echoing the storm outside. Guards moved swiftly, guiding the defendants from the room. Marcus's face twisted with fury, Sophia's with fear, Daniel's with despair. The gallery buzzed, whispers rising like the rush of wind. Harold gathered his papers slowly, his mind calm, steady. They had broken him once with laughter, but now it was his turn to watch them unravel. Not with cruelty, not with vengeance, but with justice. The storm had only just begun. The storm outside had passed by morning, leaving the streets slick with rain and the sky washed pale. Inside the courthouse, however, the storm still raged, quieter, more dangerous, the kind that brewed in men's hearts when desperation gnawed at them. The gallery was filled once more, the jury weary but resolute, and the defendants entered with the same shackled steps. But something was different. One of them had decided he could not go down quietly. Daniel, the one who had broken the day before, sat rigid in his chair, eyes darting nervously between the judge, the prosecutor, and his fellow defendants. Marcus noticed and leaned close, whispering sharply, his jaw clenched. "Keep your mouth shut. We're in this together." But Daniel didn't respond. His trembling hands betrayed him. The session began with more evidence, more damning details. The prosecutor presented internal memos, signed contracts, each one pointing directly to the deliberate theft that had drained the foundation's resources. The weight grew heavier with every revelation, pressing down on the defendants until the cracks in their composure widened. Finally, Daniel rose suddenly, his chair scraping across the floor. The courtroom gasped. His lawyer grabbed his arm, hissing, "Sit down." But Daniel shook him off. His voice broke as he turned to the bench. "Your Honor, I can't carry this anymore. I won't." The defense erupted in protest. Marcus cursed under his breath, Sophia buried her face in her hands. The gallery leaned forward, hungry for every word. Harold Bennett adjusted his glasses slowly, his face calm, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity. "Mr. Daniel," Harold said evenly, his voice cutting through the noise, "you will speak in turn, and you will speak the truth. Do you understand?" Daniel nodded frantically, tears shining in his eyes. "Yes, Your Honor. The truth is, they did it. All of it. Marcus, Sophia, the rest of them. I went along with it because I was weak, but I swear I tried to stop. They laughed at me, told me I was nothing if I didn't join them. They dragged me into it." His words spilled out in a rush, desperate and raw. The room exploded with sound. The defense shouted objections. Marcus leapt to his feet, his face red with fury. "Lies. He's lying to save himself." The gavel slammed down hard, Harold's voice ringing above the chaos. "Order. This court will have order." The gallery fell silent again, though whispers still burned like embers. Harold's gaze fell upon Marcus, and for a moment the years dissolved. He saw the boy again, standing in the back of the classroom, laughing loudly while Daniel snickered along, while Sophia whispered insults like poison. And now the same boy, grown into a man, stood shouting, panicked, desperate to keep control as it slipped away from him. Daniel slumped back into his chair, shaking, tears streaking his face. The defense demanded his testimony be stricken, but the damage was already done. The jury had seen. They had heard the crack of betrayal, the unraveling of unity. Harold let the silence stretch before he spoke. This court will weigh every word, every piece of evidence, every testimony. Truth has a way of surfacing, even when buried. And this court will not be swayed by panic nor by noise. His tone was measured, calm, yet it cut deeper than any accusation. The session ended with tension so thick it was almost unbearable. As the guards led the defendants away, Marcus turned once more toward Daniel, eyes blazing with hatred. Sophia's face was pale as ash, her hands shaking. Daniel stumbled as he was pushed forward, his eyes downcast, knowing there was no going back now. Harold gathered his papers slowly, his mind heavy with memory. Once, in that small classroom, they had banded together to humiliate him, their cruelty united. Now, in this courtroom, their unity was breaking, their power collapsing under its own weight. And Harold, who had once been the silent victim, now presided over every fracture, every fall. Justice was coming, and they could feel it closing in. The courthouse air was thick with unease. Word had spread quickly about Daniel's outburst, and by the seventh day, the gallery was more crowded than ever. Reporters filled the benches, their pens eager, their cameras waiting. The jury shuffled in, tight-lipped, their eyes sharper now. And the defendants, what little unity they had left, was gone. Marcus entered like a man on fire, his jaw set, his fists clenched. He refused to look at Daniel, who sat hunched and trembling at the end of the row. Sophia, pale and brittle, kept her gaze fixed on the floor. The guard sensed the tension and stood closer than usual. Harold Bennett watched it all from the bench, his face calm, his thoughts unreadable. But he saw it clearly, the cracks had become fractures, and today, something would break. The prosecutor rose, his voice deliberate and slow. Your Honor, in light of yesterday's testimony, the state wishes to submit additional documents corroborating Mr. Daniel's claims. These include private exchanges between Marcus and Sophia that detail the deliberate siphoning of funds. The courtroom stirred. Sophia's head snapped up, her lips parting in shock. Marcus slammed his palm against the table, his voice booming. This is a lie. He's twisting everything. I never. His lawyer pulled at his sleeve, hissing for him to sit, but Marcus shrugged him off, standing tall, his voice shaking with fury. This is a setup. Daniel is trying to save himself by dragging us down. He was just as guilty, more guilty than any of us. Gasps rippled through the room. Sophia turned to him, her voice sharp, her composure shattering. Don't you dare put this on me. You were the one who planned everything, Marcus. You dragged us all into it. The eruption was deafening. The defendants shouted over one another, their voices clashing in a storm of blame and panic. The gallery leaned forward, wide-eyed, drinking in every word. The defense attorneys scrambled, shouting objections, begging their clients to stop. The gavel struck hard, once, twice, 3 times. Harold's voice cut through the chaos, steady, commanding. Enough. His tone filled the chamber, echoing against the high walls. The shouting died, though the defendants still glared at one another, trembling with rage and fear. Harold's gaze swept over them, and for a moment, the years fell away. He saw the children again, fighting in the back of the classroom, quick to blame, quick to turn against each other when caught. The same cruelty, the same weakness, only now, the stakes were far greater. Let this court be clear, Harold said, his words deliberate, heavy. You are not in a classroom. You are not children. You stand here accused of crimes that carry the weight of law, and this court will not tolerate outbursts or petty blame-shifting. If you cannot control yourselves, the court will do it for you. His eyes lingered on Marcus, who finally lowered himself back into his chair, his anger simmering but contained by the iron force of Harold's stare. The prosecutor resumed, carefully, presenting the new documents. The jury read every line, their expressions grim. The evidence tightened its grip. The defendants shifted, restless, their masks of confidence stripped away, leaving only raw fear and anger. When the session ended, the guards moved swiftly. Marcus was dragged to his feet, his jaw clenched, his eyes still burning with defiance. Sophia walked like a shadow, broken and pale. Daniel stumbled, as if each step weighed more than he could carry. And from the bench, Harold Bennett watched. Once, they had laughed at him, united in their cruelty. Now, in this room, their laughter was gone, replaced by screams, blame, and betrayal. The lesson they had written in mockery years ago was being returned to them line by line, and Harold was the one holding the chalk. Justice was no longer a distant echo. It was unfolding before their very eyes, and it was merciless. By the 8th day, the trial had become the town's obsession. The courtroom was filled long before the session began, the air humming with whispers and restless anticipation. Reporters filled entire rows, jurors carried the weight of sleepless nights in their eyes, and the gallery buzzed like a hive waiting for honey, or blood. The defendants were led in once more, but now they no longer walked like a group. They entered as fragments, broken pieces of what once seemed unshakable. Marcus kept his head low, fury smoldering beneath his skin, his every step tight with restrained violence. Sophia moved like a ghost, pale and brittle, her eyes rimmed with sleepless red. Daniel dragged his feet, his body hunched, the chain around his wrists rattling softly in the quiet. They did not look at one another. Whatever bond had held them together had been burned to ash. The prosecutor wasted no time. He called forward another witness, a man who had once worked inside the foundation. His voice was calm, but his words were knives. I was ordered to transfer funds, to hide transactions under false accounts. Marcus signed the approvals. Sophia handled the paperwork. And Daniel, he laughed about it. Said it was easy money. The words sank into the room, heavy and final. The jury shifted uncomfortably, their faces etched with disgust. The defense objected, argued, twisted, but the weight of the testimony hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Harold Bennett listened carefully, his expression carved from stone. His robe seemed heavier that morning, the weight of years pressing against him, but he bore it with steady grace. As the witness spoke, Harold's eyes occasionally flicked toward the defendants. Marcus glared defiantly, as though he could burn a hole through the man's words. Sophia looked as if she might collapse, her hands trembling visibly. Daniel kept his face hidden, as though ashamed to even meet the room's gaze. The judge's memories stirred again. He saw Marcus as the boy who had once stood at the back of his classroom, laughing loudly, daring Harold to silence him. He saw Sophia, whispering cruel names in the ears of others, feeding their laughter with her venom. He saw Daniel, always eager to follow, to join the cruelty, as long as he was not its target. The classroom had never left them, it had only grown into darker, sharper shapes. And now, the punishment that once eluded him was within reach. The prosecutor rested his case for the day, but Harold did not dismiss the court immediately. He leaned forward, his glasses catching the light, his voice quiet but powerful. This court has now heard evidence that reveals not just mistakes, but choices. Choices made in greed, in arrogance, in disregard for those who trusted you. It is not for me to decide guilt today. That will come in time. But let it be clear, the law sees beyond excuses, beyond fear, beyond broken alliances. The law sees truth. The silence that followed was crushing. No one moved, no one whispered. The words hung in the air like a judgment yet to fall, like a storm still building. When the gavel struck, it was sharp and final, the sound echoing into every corner of the room. The defendants were taken away, each step heavier than the last. Marcus walked stiffly, his pride cracking with every rattle of his chains. Sophia wept silently as she was led out, her tears leaving faint trails on her pale cheeks. Daniel shuffled like a man carrying the weight of a mountain. And Harold remained seated, his eyes steady, his heart calm. Years ago, they had mocked him in the classroom, their laughter cruel and careless. Today, their laughter was gone. In its place stood silence, fear, and the creeping knowledge that justice was closing in like the walls of the courtroom itself. The boy they had scorned was long gone. Only the judge remained. The courtroom was restless before the session even began. A sense of inevitability had crept into the air, a heaviness that pressed down on everyone seated inside. The jurors arrived with grim faces, the gallery whispered intense excitement, and the reporters clutched their pens as though they were weapons ready to capture the final blows. This was no longer just a trial, it was a reckoning. When the defendants entered, the room seemed to recoil. Marcus still carried the flicker of defiance in his eyes, but it was weaker now, dimmed by sleepless nights and endless chains. Sophia moved as if her body had grown fragile, each step careful, as though she might shatter if she faltered. Daniel followed behind them, his head bowed, his lips moving silently as if whispering prayers he had once mocked in others. They were no longer a unit, no longer the cruel chorus of voices from Harold's past. They were fragments, broken and scattered. The prosecutor stood and addressed the jury with the weight of weeks behind him. Ladies and gentlemen, you have seen the documents. You have heard the witnesses. You have read their words and seen their hands in the crimes. What remains is not doubt, but accountability. These defendants were not careless. They were not ignorant. They were deliberate. And the law must answer. Every word rang through the chamber like the tolling of a bell. The defense tried to counter, their voices strained, arguments recycled, desperate. But the tide had turned long ago, and everyone knew it. The jury watched with unflinching eyes, their expressions heavy with certainty. Harold Bennett sat above it all, his presence quiet but immovable. He looked down at Marcus, at Sophia, at Daniel, and saw the ghosts of children once seated in his classroom. Their laughter had haunted him, their cruelty had scarred him, but now, sitting in his robe, he understood something deeper. Their laughter had not destroyed him, it had forged him. The humiliation, the long nights of study, the quiet pain of being overlooked, all of it had carried him here, to this very moment. When the prosecutor finished, the silence was suffocating. The jury was dismissed to deliberate, and the courtroom emptied slowly, buzzing with expectation. Harold remained in his seat, staring at the empty defense table where the three once sat. He could still hear their laughter echoing in his memory, but now it seemed faint, almost hollow, like the distant sound of a storm that had already passed. Hours later, the jury returned. The room filled again, the air thick, hearts pounding in unison. The foreman stood, paper trembling in his hands. Harold's voice, calm and steady, filled the chamber. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The gallery held its breath. The foreman's voice cracked slightly as he spoke, but the words landed with the force of stone. "On the charge of fraud, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of embezzlement, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy, guilty." A collective gasp filled the room. Sophia broke instantly, sobbing into her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. Daniel crumpled forward, his head pressed against the table as though he could disappear into the wood. Marcus, however, stared straight ahead, his face locked in stone, though his clenched jaw betrayed the fury clawing inside him. Harold did not move. He let the moment stretch, the weight of the verdict sinking into every soul present. Then, his voice rose, even, deliberate, inescapable. "The jury has spoken. This court accepts the verdict." His gaze lingered on the defendants, his tone carrying a quiet finality. Justice has no memory of laughter or cruelty. It has only memory of truth. And the truth has found you guilty. The gavel struck once, a sound that seemed to split the air in two. The room erupted with whispers, reporters rushing to scribble history onto paper, the gallery trembling with awe and disbelief. Guards stepped forward, their chains ready, and the three once proud tormentors were led away, not as the untouchable figures they had believed themselves to be, but as convicts stripped of power, dignity, and pride. And from the bench, Harold Bennett watched them go, not with vengeance, not with triumph, but with the steady calm of a man who had waited his entire life for justice to speak on his behalf. The teacher they mocked was gone forever. In his place stood the judge who had decided their fate. The courtroom was quieter than it had ever been. The verdict had been delivered, the weight of it still hanging like smoke in the rafters, and now only one thing remained: sentencing. The gallery was full once again, but the energy had shifted. Gone was the restless anticipation, replaced by a heavy silence, a collective holding of breath. Everyone knew they were about to witness the final act. The defendants were led in, their chains rattling softly, their faces stripped bare of pretense. Sophia's eyes were swollen from crying, her once proud posture bent like a broken branch. Daniel looked hollow, as though the verdict had already drained the last of his spirit. Marcus, however, still carried himself with defiance, though his eyes betrayed the storm inside. He refused to bow his head, but his clenched fists and trembling jaw revealed the cracks beneath the mask. Harold Bennett sat high upon the bench, the robe draped around him like the black wings of judgment. He looked down at the three before him, and for a moment, time collapsed. He saw them as they were now, criminals waiting for punishment, and as they had once been, children laughing in a classroom, careless and cruel. The two images overlapped until they were one, and Harold felt the strange ache of inevitability. This was always where their paths had been leading. The prosecutor rose first, his voice steady. He spoke of the gravity of their crimes, the damage they had caused, the lives ruined by their greed. "Your Honor," he concluded, "the state requests the maximum sentence allowable by law. Anything less would dishonor the victims and the trust they betrayed." The defense pleaded desperately. They spoke of second chances, of broken homes, of pressures unseen. They painted Sophia as a woman swept along by others, Daniel as a man too weak to resist, Marcus as someone misunderstood. Their words filled the air but landed hollow, shadows in a room already filled with light. Finally, Harold leaned forward, and the room went still. His voice, low and even, carried more weight than any argument. I have listened to the evidence. I have heard the testimony. I have seen the choices you made, not once, but again and again, with full knowledge of the harm you would cause. The jury has spoken. The law is clear. And now it is this court's duty to pass sentence. He paused, his eyes lingering on each of them. On Sophia, whose sobs trembled through her body. On Daniel, who sat hollow and shaking. And on Marcus, who stared back at him with rage, the last ember of pride flickering in his eyes. Harold adjusted his glasses, the familiar gesture that once drew laughter, but now drew only silence. When I was younger, Harold said slowly, his words carrying the echo of memory, I stood in front of you as a teacher. You mocked me. You laughed at me. You told me I was nothing. I bore that cruelty in silence. But silence is not weakness. Silence remembers. Silence endures. And silence waits. The gallery froze. Reporters leaned forward, their pens hovering in the air. The defendants stared at him, stunned, realizing fully now who he was. I am not the man you mocked anymore. I am the law you chose to defy. And today, the law will speak. His voice hardened. Marcus, Sophia, Daniel, you are each sentenced to 20 years in prison without possibility of parole. You will serve your time not as victims, not as misunderstood souls, but as criminals who must answer for their choices. The gavel struck, the sound reverberating through the chamber like thunder. Sophia collapsed into sobs, her cries echoing against the walls. Daniel covered his face with his hands, his shoulders heaving with despair. Marcus sat frozen, his eyes locked on Harold, fury and disbelief burning, but powerless now, utterly powerless. The guards moved in, their chains clinking louder than ever. The gallery erupted into a storm of whispers, reporters scribbling history, the air electric with the finality of it all. Harold remained still, his face calm, his hands resting on the bench. Inside, he felt no triumph, no gloating. Only a deep, quiet release. The laughter that had once haunted him was gone, replaced at last by silence, by justice. The teacher they mocked had waited a lifetime for this moment. And now, as they were led away in chains, that teacher no longer existed. Only the judge remained. That evening, when the courthouse had emptied and the echoes of the gavel had faded into memory, Harold Bennett sat alone in his chambers. The robe lay folded across the chair beside him, the weight of it finally lifted, though its shadow lingered heavy on his shoulders. The room was quiet, lit only by the soft glow of a single lamp, its light falling across the scattered papers on his desk. He leaned back slowly, removing his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose as though he could rub away the years themselves. For the first time in days, there was no noise, no whispers, no shuffling jurors or gasping galleries. Only silence. And yet in that silence, the voices of the past returned to him. He heard Marcus laughing at the back of the classroom, his tone sharp, cruel. He heard Sophia's whispering, the kind that spread like poison until the whole room laughed. He heard Daniel's snickers, the sound of someone too weak to stand alone but too eager to join the mob. He saw himself standing there, chalk in hand, glasses slipping down his nose, face burning with humiliation as his authority dissolved under their jeers. Those memories had never left him. They had lived inside him, buried but alive, shaping the man he became. Now those same voices had fallen silent. Their laughter was gone, replaced by tears, by broken pleas, by the sound of chains. Justice had spoken, and it had spoken through him. But instead of triumph, Harold felt only a strange emptiness. He rose and walked to the bookshelf in his chamber. Among the rows of law volumes sat an old worn briefcase, the same one he had carried as a teacher all those years ago. He pulled it down, dust coating his hands, and opened it. Inside were fragments of a life long past, faded lesson plans, old student essays, notes he had written in the margins of textbooks. His fingers lingered on them, the ghost of chalk dust still in his mind. He wondered for a moment, what might have been? What if he had never walked away? What if he had endured and stayed the course, forever the ridiculed teacher, forever their victim? Would he have been destroyed, swallowed by their cruelty? Or was this always his path, the long road the humiliation had carved for him? Harold closed the briefcase and set it gently back on the shelf. His reflection stared back at him faintly from the darkened window, older now, lined with age but stronger. The teacher was gone, but he lived still in memory, and perhaps that was enough. He sat again, folded his hands on the desk, and allowed himself one final thought before extinguishing the lamp. Justice is not revenge. Justice is balance. What they took from him in laughter, he returned not with anger but with the law. That was the difference. That was why he had endured. The chamber fell into darkness. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the quiet man who had closed a circle that had begun so many years ago in a small classroom with peeling paint and the sound of cruel laughter. And in that silence, Harold Bennett finally breathed freely. The morning after the sentencing, Harold Bennett walked out of the courthouse without his robe, just an ordinary man once more. The autumn air was crisp, the streets alive with chatter, but for him the world felt strangely quiet. The trial that had consumed weeks of his life was over, the verdict sealed, the defendants carried away to serve their time. Yet Harold did not feel the fire of triumph that the newspapers had printed in bold headlines. He felt something quieter, deeper, a closing of a circle. He took the long route home, past the old neighborhood where children once pointed and laughed at the failed teacher. Many of those shops were gone now, replaced by newer faces, but the ghosts remained. He paused outside the crumbling brick building that had once been his school. The paint was more faded, the windows more cracked, but he could still see it as it had been. Rows of restless students, chalkboards covered in equations, his own voice drowned out by mocking laughter. He stood there for a long time, watching the shadows of memory flicker across the glass. The teacher they had ridiculed had not survived in that room. He had left, carrying his humiliation like a wound that never healed. And yet, from that wound, something stronger had grown. A passerby recognized him, an older woman, a parent from long ago. She stopped, surprise in her eyes. "Judge Bennett?" she asked softly. I heard what you did. You gave this town justice." He nodded politely, offering only a small smile. He did not need to explain. She moved on, and he remained for a moment longer before turning away. At home, he placed his glasses carefully on the desk and sat beside the shelves of law books that had guided his nights. Yet his eyes wandered to the old briefcase tucked away in the corner, the relic of a life that had begun this journey. He opened it once more, pulling out a single faded essay written by a child decades ago. The handwriting was clumsy, the words full of mistakes, but the effort was earnest. He had given it a grade of B with a note of encouragement scribbled in red ink: "Keep trying. You're capable of more than you know." Harold smiled faintly. Even in those years of mockery, he had tried to plant seeds. Some had been trampled, but others may have taken root. Perhaps that too was justice, the quiet kind unseen, the kind that carried forward long after laughter had faded. As the evening sun fell across his desk, Harold leaned back in his chair. The teacher they mocked was gone forever. In his place stood a man who had endured, who had risen, who had delivered justice not just for himself, but for those who had been harmed by the greed of others. The laughter of the past no longer haunted him. It had been silenced by the steady voice of truth. And as the world outside carried on, Harold Bennett finally allowed himself peace. The circle was complete.